The meeting of U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing on May 14th and 15th. Critical moment for global politics and the global economy. The summit will be the first visit to China by an American president in nearly a decade. The last time Trump flew to Beijing to meet Xi was in 2017. The latest meeting comes roughly 6 months after the two leaders last met in person on the sidelines of a summit in Busan, South Korea, in October 2025. As the world's two largest economies sit across the table once again, we take a look at the relations between these two superpowers. This time the backdrop is very different. The US and China are two global powers locked in an increasingly intense competition, and yet their economies remain deeply connected. For decades, the United States and China helped drive global growth together. American companies expanded through Chinese manufacturing. China benefited from global trade and access to international markets. But as Beijing's economic and military power grew, so did Washington's concerns. Beijing's global ambitions have expanded far beyond its borders. From the Belt and Road Initiative to its growing presence in Africa, China has been building influence across continents. And for the United States, China's rapid growth has become a major strategic concern. So when did these two powers begin competing? How dependent are they on each other? How fast has China risen economically and militarily? Will the meeting define the next phase of the world's biggest power rivalry? All this and more on WION Wideangle this week. For much of the 20th century, the United States and China stood on opposite sides of global politics. In 1949, Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic of China after the Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War. The United States refused to recognize the communist government in Beijing and instead continued to support the nationalist government that had moved to Taiwan. Soon after, the Korean War brought the two countries into direct conflict. The United States backed South Korea, while China supported the North. Way back in 1950, during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, the UN offensive led by United States forces approached the Yalu River, leading to massive confrontations with Chinese forces. This was the only direct, large-scale military confrontation between the United States and the People's Republic of China. 30,000 UN command troops were encircled and attacked by 120,000 Chinese soldiers. After severe casualties in extreme weather, the UN forces broke out of the encirclement and withdrew to the port of Hungnam, where they were airlifted. Many U.S. historians describe it as the greatest evacuation movement by sea in U.S. military history. For decades, relations between Washington and Beijing remained hostile. But in the 1970s, that changed. The United States wanted to counter the growing power of the Soviet Union. China, too, was drifting away from Moscow after its relationship with the Soviets deteriorated, known as the Sino-Soviet split. Both sides saw strategic value in working together. In 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon made a historic visit to China. It was the first time an American president had visited the country. The visit opened the door to a new phase in U.S. China relations. 7 years later, in 1979, the United States officially established diplomatic relations with China. Around the same time, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping began introducing major economic reforms. China started opening its economy to the world. Foreign companies were allowed to invest, private business activity expanded, and manufacturing grew rapidly. and American companies saw a huge opportunity. China offered low-cost labor, a massive workforce, and the possibility of access to one of the world's biggest markets. Over the next 2 decades, thousands of American businesses shifted manufacturing to China. This economic relationship benefited both sides.
It was a fascinating time with U.S. Chinese relations, because China had been really isolated after 1948 with the communists in charge, and it was very secretive and very isolated, and they suffered from famine, they suffered from starvation. And interesting, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State for President Nixon, actually visited China, and that surprised a lot of people. But it sort of opened China up to the world, and they didn't necessarily have any notable reforms, but at least it got the countries on a more friendly footing, and in spite of the fact that China continued to be really hostile to their own people. But it was the beginning of the changes for China, the move toward a market economy.
The ministerial conference so agrees.
In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, a decision that accelerated China's rise as a global manufacturing powerhouse. Its economy expanded at a speed the world had never seen before. By the 2010s, China had become the world's second largest economy and one of America's biggest trading partners. At the same time, China's becoming part of the World Trade Organization brought lower prices to American consumers and higher profits for U.S. corporations. But it also came with costs, notably the loss of American jobs due to import competition, automation, and multinational companies moving manufacturing overseas. But as trade grew, so did tensions. American leaders and businesses accused China of flaunting some of its World Trade Organization commitments, unfair trade practices.
Today's action pertains to what we believe is China's wrongful imposition.
They claimed China was giving heavy government support to its own companies, making it harder for foreign businesses to compete. At the same time, the U.S. trade deficit with China kept widening, and eventually that economic competition turned into a trade war.
Hi, Donald John Trump.
In 2018, during his first term as president, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese goods worth billions of dollars. The U.S. said the move was necessary to counter what it called unfair Chinese trade practices. China responded with its own tariffs on American products. It targeted U.S. exports including soybeans, agricultural products, automobiles, and other goods. Very quickly, the world's 2 largest economies were engaged in an economic conflict. The trade war disrupted global supply chains, created uncertainty for businesses, and affected markets across the world. The competition soon expanded into areas like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, 5G technology, and critical minerals. Then in 2020, the 2 sides signed what was known as the Phase 1 trade deal. China agreed to purchase more American goods, and the United States reduced some tariffs, but many of the larger disagreements remained unresolved.
Well, I think it was primarily the growth of China, starting in 2001, when we and the rest of the WTO allowed them into the global trading system, thinking perhaps naively that they would embrace, if they embraced capital or market economies or market economics, that would bring them into a more democratic system. And we were totally wrong on that. They've remained mercantilist. They've remained again hostile to their own people with their communist government. And so I think in retrospect it might have been a mistake. But it is interesting how the CCP has grown so powerful because of these economic changes and because of their economic growth, and so now they've become somewhat of an adversarial military factor.
Under the former President Joe Biden, the United States kept many of the Trump-era tariffs in place.
I, Donald John Trump.
In 2025, Donald Trump returned to the White House, and with his return, attention on U.S. China trade policy grew once again. In February 2025, the United States imposed an additional 10% tariff on all Chinese goods. A month later, that rate was raised to 20%. Then in April 2025, the Trump administration announced a 34% reciprocal tariff on Chinese imports. After China responded with its own counter-tariffs, Washington further increased the rate first to 84% and then to 125%. With other existing duties already in place, the total U.S. tariff burden on some Chinese goods reached as high as 145%. Right now, there is no single tariff rate on all Chinese goods.
After the CCP gained power, it became more suppressive, you can say, to its own population, to any pursuit for democracy developed inside China. And it even actually suppressed the freedom and totally destroyed the freedom of Hong Kong, which was called a sort of independent. And another problem is the CCP has been heavily stealing the technology from the US, of course, and other countries. For any foreign technology company, if you want to go invest in China, and it forces you to transfer the technology.
Despite years of tensions, trade wars and strategic competition, the United States and China remain deeply interconnected. They are the world's two largest economies, and for decades their economic relationship has helped shape global trade, manufacturing, technology, and supply chains. In fact, experts say fully decoupling these two huge economies is likely impossible. U.S. goods and services trade with China was estimated at more than $650 billion in 2024. For the United States, China has long been a major manufacturing hub. American companies depend on Chinese factories for a wide range of products like electronics and machinery, pharmaceutical ingredients, batteries, solar panels, and consumer goods. Many global supply chains still run through China. Even when American companies shift some production to countries like Vietnam or Mexico, Chinese components and raw materials often remain part of that supply network. At the same time, China also depends on the United States in several important areas. The United States remains one of China's biggest export markets. Millions of Chinese jobs have been linked directly or indirectly to export-driven industries. For years, Chinese factories produced goods for American companies and consumers on a massive scale. And despite falling trade numbers in recent years, the US market continues to be important for Chinese exporters. China also continues to rely on the United States for certain high-end technologies. This is especially true in the semiconductor industry. That is why Washington's export restrictions on advanced semiconductors have become such a major issue for Beijing. Key components for China's domestic aircraft COMAC C919 are also sourced from American suppliers. Energy is another example of this interdependence. The United States has been an important supplier of products like LNG, ethane, and propane to China. And even during periods of trade tensions, some of this energy trade has continued because both sides benefit from it.
I think that's one of the biggest mistakes the US made in the past several decades. Again, it has, I think, moved a lot of manufacturing sector to China because of the cheap labor there and the very, very weak environment regulations and, of course, human rights cost. So right now, all of a sudden, America, especially during the COVID, America suddenly found that they could even make their own masks. And the Chinese Communist Party could even use the mask supply as a as a leverage to force other countries to apply it to listen to the CCP. The two economies are now so deeply, you can say, emerged into each other, the supply chain. So it is very hard for the US to suddenly say, okay, because of the trade deficit, let's stop doing business with China.
In 2010, Google effectively stopped operating its search engine in mainland China. After disagreements with the Chinese government over censorship and cybersecurity, over time, Google services became largely inaccessible inside China. The Great Firewall of China is the Chinese government's internet censorship and surveillance project. The ban prevents social media platforms like Facebook and X from reaching the country's over 800 million internet users, although users manage to find VPNs to circumvent the ban. Chinese government censorship focuses primarily on two things: stopping people in China from accessing independent reports about events in their own country, and isolating Chinese citizens from conversations with outsiders. Instead of depending on foreign platforms, China built its own digital ecosystem, and very quickly domestic companies filled the space left behind by Google. The biggest example is Baidu, often called China's Google. Baidu grew into the country's dominant search engine. It developed its own search platform, maps, cloud services, online forums, and AI tools. Over the years, other Chinese platforms also expanded rapidly. In fact, in China, search today does not only happen through traditional search engines. Millions of users search directly inside apps like WeChat and Douyin for news, shopping, restaurants, videos, and reviews. For decades, the United States has been the world's most powerful military force, with hundreds of military bases across the world, the most advanced air force, and the largest defense budget on the planet. Washington has long maintained global military dominance, but over the last 2 decades, China has rapidly expanded and modernized its military. And today, the United States sees it as its biggest strategic competitor. The difference in military spending still remains massive. In 2026, the United States is spending more than $900 billion on defense. China's official defense budget is estimated between $275 to $277 billion. But defense analysts say China's real military capabilities have grown far beyond what its budget alone suggests. China has the largest military in the world by active personnel, boasting over 2 million active soldiers as of 2026. In the second spot is India, and the United States holds the third largest active force. But Washington continues to hold the advantage in global reach. The U.S. has 11 active aircraft carriers. China currently has 3. The American military also operates hundreds of overseas bases across different regions of the world. But China's focus has been different. Beijing has not tried to match America everywhere across the world. Instead, it has focused heavily on building power in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly around Taiwan and the South China Sea. And in that region, China's military capabilities have grown rapidly. The country now has the world's largest navy by number of ships. Its naval fleet has expanded quickly with new destroyers, submarines, aircraft carriers, and advanced missile systems. Its air force has been modernized with 5th-generation stealth fighter jets like the J-20, and reports suggest China is also moving quickly in the development of 6th-generation fighter aircraft. The Pentagon has repeatedly warned about China's fast military modernization. A recent U.S. defense assessment described China's military buildup as historic. The report said China is rapidly expanding its nuclear, naval, cyber, and long-range strike capabilities. While the U.S. still maintains an advantage in technology and global alliances, American officials have increasingly warned that the gap between the two militaries is narrowing.
Militarily, of course, both countries has been, I think, trying to build a very strong military power. And China's military budget has always been, I think, in two-digit growth rate in all these years. And its military spending has always been outpace the growth of its GDP. But again, the same problem exists. It does not have enough innovation. You can say science and technology is rely on learning initially from former Soviet Union. A lot of their main weapon system are actually adopted from the former Soviet Union system, and later learn or steal from the America.
The biggest flashpoint between the US and China remains Taiwan. Beijing considers Taiwan a part of China under its One China principle. The Chinese government has repeatedly said that it wants reunification with the island and has not ruled out the use of force to achieve it. But Taiwan has its own government, its own military, and a separate democratic political system. Many people in Taiwan identify separately from mainland China and support maintaining the island's current self-governing status. The United States, meanwhile, follows what is known as the One China policy. Under this policy, Washington officially recognizes the government in Beijing as the legal government of China, but at the same time it maintains unofficial relations with Taiwan. The United States also continues to supply weapons to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. China opposes U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, military cooperation with the island, and any move that it believes supports Taiwanese independence. In recent years, tensions across the Taiwan Strait have grown sharply. China has increased military drills around the island, sent warships and fighter jets near Taiwan, and stepped up pressure on Taipei. The United States, on the other hand, has increased support for Taiwan's defense. In 2025, the Trump administration approved an $11 billion arms package for Taiwan, one of the largest in recent years. China strongly criticized the move.
The US side has openly announced a massive plan to sell advanced weapons to Taiwan, which seriously violates the One China principle and the 3 China-US joint communiques, gravely undermines China's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, severely disrupts peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and sends a seriously wrong signal to separatist forces advocating Taiwan independence. China firmly opposes this and strongly condemns it.
Taiwan has become one of the most dangerous flashpoints in global politics today. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, is aiming to enhance connectivity, trade, and economic cooperation across Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. BRI projects often result in a shift toward China, undermining U.S. partnerships and reducing American influence in key regions like the Asia-Pacific. The geopolitical alignment between the United States and China continues to shape the global order.